Do you guys want to stay on while I do the intro?
Sounds good.
Oops. Okay, I'm going to welcome everyone to the 8th Annual Hunter Museum Student Symposium. It's so exciting to have this, and we're just really delighted and honored to be able to present this year. Obviously, like everyone, we did not know what would happen this year, and last year we had to cancel our symposium because it fell about 2 weeks after COVID shut everything down. So it's wonderful to be able to return to this program, and particularly this year has been just a thrill to work with these students. As those of you who are familiar with the Student Symposium know, each year we have the symposium that is loosely tied to an exhibit or a gallery at the Hunter. And we try to come up with themes that are rather open so that students across disciplines from universities across the country can apply. And so this year we were really inspired by an exhibition called Under Construction, Collage from the Mint Museum that's currently at the Hunter. And Dr. Wolf has one of the pieces from the exhibit behind her by Howard Dean of Hindell. And what we did is we took the concept of collage very broadly, and we made this symposium into piecing together identities and inviting papers that dealt with identity along every possible spectrum of interest and using every discipline of interest. And knowing that this was going to be a very different year and that students were under pressures that they'd never been before, we were really not sure how many or who would be up for the task of taking on something extra. And we were astounded by the number, the breadth, the depth of the applications and proposals that came in. So even the process of selecting was a beautiful and challenging one. And I was so excited that Dr. Wolf and Dr. Mandravelis from UTC's Department of Art agreed to be my partners in this path as we selected these 9 papers that are tremendous, and everyone is in for such a treat. We've gotten to watch them grow from proposals to videos. This is an added challenge for everyone because not only were they presenting, but they were pre-presenting and creating these video presentations that actually remind us once again how great this generation is at adaptation, and they really did a beautiful job. So what we'll be doing today is we're going to bring on, I have all the videos loaded, so we'll bring on the student whose video is going to be seen, and the professor who's going to be leading that part of the panel. The professor will be introducing the student. You'll see the video, and we'll do this with a sequence of presentations, and then we'll do a larger Q&A for the first group of students, and then we'll follow with a second. And this will make more sense when I share my screen so that you can all see. Let's do slideshow. Here we go. So here you can see all of the papers. So we'll be doing the first 5 and then a break for Q&A and discussion, and then the last 4. So with that, I am going to have Dr. Wolf is going to stay on screen with us. And 1 second. And we will be starting. It's always the fun of being the Zoom host. Here we go. And so we are going to start by bringing on to the screen Ellie Fitzgerald. So I'm going to bring Ellie on and let Dr. Wolf start to talk.
As Ellie comes on, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our presenters once again, and thank Adira for putting together this symposium. She's so committed to gathering together an array of students every year to present their work. It's really exciting to be collaborating with my colleague Stephen Mandrivelis on 2 panels this year, thanks to an enormous interest. And we really have, as Adira said, some remarkable presentations. So it's really an honor to present all of the students here today. I'll be moderating this first panel, and this is comprised of Ellie Fitzgerald, Chelsey Paige, Sydney Young, Liana Salazar, and Tacy Snyder. And I'll have the honor to begin by presenting Ellie Fitzgerald, who comes to us from the University of Connecticut. She is presenting her paper today, Piecing Together Identities, Susan Hudson, Contemporary Quilt Art and Interrogations of Violence. And with that, we'll begin with the video. I think we're missing the audio. Am I right?
That's what I was afraid of. 1 second.
I'll also take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us today, all our audience members. And looks like we're ready for another go.
Hello, my name is Ellie Fitzgerald, and I'm excited and honored to share with you today the subject of my paper for the Piecing Together Identities Symposium, Susan Hudson, Contemporary Indigenous Quilt Artist. Broadly, the American quilt still retains much of its charming associations with white Eurocolonial rustic folk culture, a romanticized early American society, and core Puritan values of virtue through self-control, hard work, and responsibility. One might call to mind an old woman sitting in a rocking chair like this, peacefully sewing a neat, geometric, colorful patchwork quilt, or the memory of one's own family quilts. And one can see from just a basic Google Images search that the connection between quilting and white, harmless femininity is still very much alive. The inclusion of the quilt into art history and visual culture conversations is a relatively new phenomenon. The shift is generally understood to have occurred in the 1970s, with both the American Bicentennial of 1976 and the Whitney Exhibition of 1971, Abstract Design in American Quilts, reviving interest in quilts and their placement in museums and galleries. A feminist reclamation of the craft art supported this revival, and quilts were raised up and honored as a retrospective evidence of the thriving artistic creativity of women despite their preclusion from other artistic practices, especially for women of overlapping racial and class identities. Yet this transition was a far cry from inclusive. This recognition was, and is, often dismissive, or worse, simply reaching for non-threatening symbols of diversity. The inclusion of African American quilters in these second-wave feminist narratives, most famously with the Gee's Bend quilters, did not disrupt the dominance of whiteness in museum and gallery spaces, because they have not diverted from the idea of a culture of quilting as a happy, community-based activity for women, perhaps by curatorial design. Quilting remains unchallenged and uncritiqued, even as the perception of quilting has, on the surface, expanded. The result has been the creation of an idealized neutering narrative that falls short of representing the more complex nature and potential of quilting, a narrative that requires intervention. Through a novel engagement with violence in her dual reclamation of quilting and Indigenous history, contemporary artist Susan Hudson proves that the oversimplification of quilt history and its integration into art historical narratives facilitates a condescending viewership of quilt art that sustains distorted, harmful representations of quilt artists. Quilt artist Susan Hudson, Navajo of the Kinya'ani and the Apache people, has created a body of work that is deeply dissonant with those romanticized, charming associations. Her quilts are violent. They stare back at the viewer and force them to encounter the trauma inflicted upon her family and her people by Manifest Destiny policy and the systematic American genocide of Indigenous communities. Each of her quilts is a story passed down from an oral tradition and communicated visually. Underlying these pieces is a sense of urgency and insistence that these stories will not be lost or forgiven. Hudson intends for her work to simultaneously function as both an art object and a functional form of record-keeping for future generations. Although functionality towards remembrance is a familiar dimension for quilt art, mourning quilts have existed for centuries, most recently and prominently with the Ace quilt. Hudson's quilts are set apart because they subvert the expectations of the quilt by making the viewer uncomfortable with their voyeurism and positionality. The idealized, harmless, and chillingly pervasive quilting narrative, by default, ignores the artistic possibilities provided by allowing the quilt to be ugly, as Hudson does. The first way that Susan Hudson's work subverts and expands the potential of broader narratives about quilting is through her fraught violence and oppressive contact with the quilt, the medium she reclaims. Hudson grew up on the Navajo Sheep Springs Reservation in New Mexico. Hudson's mother was forced into residential boarding schools as a child, and it was there that she learned to sew and quilt from Christian missionaries. The school sold the quilts made by the children to raise money, trapping them as unpaid labor and beating them if their work was not neat. When Hudson was a child herself, her mother taught her to sew out of necessity. The violence, disruption, and subsequent abandonment of the Navajo reservation by the missionaries and American officials intentionally left communities like Hudson's much more vulnerable to poverty, and Hudson's mother turned to the marketable skill of quilting to support her family. As direct evidence of the threat of generational trauma, Hudson's mother would hit her if she did not sew neatly, just like the Christian missionaries had. Later in her life, Hudson began to quilt again to make money. These early quilts do not fit in with her later resistance art. They were commercial, designed to be bought. Hudson used the popular Lakota star, which is not part of her Navajo heritage, and leaned into consumer desires to possess indigenous objects. It was only upon the prompting of one of her patrons, Senator Ben Nighthorse, that Hudson considered making work that actually expressed her ideas, as opposed to making what would sell. It cannot be denied that Hudson's encounter with the practice of quilting is not simple or sweet, but it must be part of the larger quilting narrative. The choice of quilting as a medium, for Hudson, was not much of a choice at all. Quilting was weaponized. It was used as a tool of oppression that Hudson only later could address, and that cannot be ignored. This history is layered on the surface of every one of Hudson's quilts. Hudson's quilts represent more novel opportunities that lie outside of the idealized quilt discourse, with the stylistic echoes she chose to make when she began her resistance and memory quilts. Hudson's quilts are enriched by the translation of ledger painting styles. The ledger painting style emerged in the mid to late 19th and early 20th centuries as indigenous artists had more access to paper from government officials and missionaries, and less access to their typical writing support for narrative paintings, buffalo hides. In her resistance quilts, Hudson represents the paper and the paint of ledger paintings, in thread and fabric, as she simultaneously tells a specific story about the Navajo code talkers of World War II, as is in this work, 29 Warriors. While looking at Hudson's ledger quilts, the stylistic choice to use transmateriality and engage the viewer's association of Hudson's quilt in the larger narrative of the necessary adaptation of indigenous artists to their forced and colonized circumstances is, in short, brilliant. It is also uncomfortable, making it incompatible with the idea of a neutral, non-threatening quilt. To ignore the implications of the transmateriality and connection to larger narratives about violence against indigenous people would be a harmful oversimplification. To do so would be to intervene in Hudson's attempt to regain agency in the history and visual culture of her people. Again, Hudson's work brings up another way in which quilts are not easy, simple, or sweet, and how assuming so would belittle their true depth and possibility as works of art. Any of Hudson's quilts could easily be chosen to build a case for the novel way she encounters violence in the content of her resistance ledger-style quilts, but for this purpose we will only focus on one, missing and murdered indigenous women since 1492. Hudson describes her position in the creative process as more of a conduit than a creative force. Through dreams, Hudson's ancestors show her images of memories and legends and offer her ideas for what is important to translate into a quilt. After the same image has been shown to her multiple times, or deeply moves her, Hudson begins to plan out the idea for the image. Called on by the Great Spirit, Hudson sees the creation of quilts and the reclamation of these histories as her ultimate purpose in life. Her ancestors are present in her work and stand beside her as she shoulders the responsibility of sorting through and representing incredibly traumatic and difficult memories for her community. As mentioned above, mourning quilts are the closest thing to Hudson's work, but never before have quilts been tasked with addressing such a scope of trauma, genocide, and racist violence. One work that stands out in particular is this piece, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Since 1492, which serves as almost a gravestone. Hudson's applique of fabric that looks objects like clothes and possessions left behind by these missing and murdered women draw the viewer's attention to a problem related to the intersectionality between Indigenous and gender identities. She refuses to let them be forgotten, even though the true magnitude of the femicide over 5 centuries cannot be comprehended. This content is the true core of Hudson's work, the impetus to remember, even though it is a Herculean, unfinishable task. Her work is terrible to hold on to, yet paradoxically impossible to let go of. This emotional weight is something viewers might not be accustomed to experiencing upon viewing a quilt, and is dissonant with a quilting narrative that is based around the frankly sexist fallacy that something about the quilt is inherently good, domestic, and harmless. Hudson's work proved that the quilt is just as capable as other forms of art in expressing negativity in constructive, meaningful ways, even as it is an uphill battle to get viewers to engage with her work in that way. Hudson's history, artistic style, and content all combine into a body of work that engages and reclaims the violence and trauma of both quilting and Indigenous history, a novel thing for the quilt. Without removing the lens of the idealized neutering narrative of quilting that does not make space for violence, the true possibility of Hudson's quilts represent in further explorations of trauma, loss, and violence through that medium is lost. The inclusion of quilt art that is deeply critical of American culture, and specifically American quilt culture, is simply a necessity to a full history of the American quilt. The main takeaway that one can extract from the possibilities pioneered by Hudson's work is this: quilts are not innocent, their hands are not cleaned in stories of trauma, and they are not simply bystanders. Ignoring the aspects of quilts that do address this, like Hudson's, harmfully oversimplifies the works, and condescends to the artists. It would be impossible to view Hudson's quilts without running up against its direct clash with the idealized narrative of quilting. Without the rage and blame, they would merely become interesting, or worse, well-made. The viewer must be allowed to see quilts that do not forgive them. It is important to embrace quilts that do not like other quilts. If painters may criticize painting and sculptors may criticize the practice of sculpting, then quilt artists can learn how to criticize quilting, starting with Susan Hudson's example. As demonstrated in this analysis, frameworks such as transmateriality offer a productive path to expand quilting discourse. If these deeper reflections on the practice of quilting can be introduced, academics and practitioners alike may yet be able to foster a discourse that is truly inclusive, not oversimplified, and not harmful in regards to reading the complex forms and histories of this artistic tradition. Thank you.
A round of applause. I know those of you at home are applauding virtually. And thank you so much, Ellie, for this powerful piece, unpacking the discourse surrounding quilt history and also shedding light on the powerful production of Susan Hudson. And so now, next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Chelsey Paige. I also want to thank Ellie for activating the chat and remind our viewers that as they are listening to these presentations, they're also welcome to comment in the chat and to be sure to save questions for this Q&A session. So with that, we'll transition to our next speaker, Chelsey Paige. Chelsey comes to us from our own UTC, the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and she's presenting her research on Libby Paloma via her paper, Assemblaged Identities, What Libby Paloma Wants You to Know.
Hello, my name is Chelsey Paige, and I will be presenting on Assemblaged Identities, What Libby Paloma Wants You to Know for the 2021 Virtual Hunter Museum Symposium, Piecing Together Identities. Libby Paloma is a Chicanx queer interdisciplinary artist from California working with themes of intersectional identity, iconography, and family in her works. Focusing on her series, Assemblages, Lo que no sabrías, What You Wouldn't Know, Paloma explores herself and her family with these assemblages of using dinner plates that are decorated in beads, found materials, and photographs of herself and her family members. Paloma utilizes Assemblages Lo que no sabrías to explore her cultural identity while honoring these intimate familial relationships and share her interpersonal experiences as a queer Chicanx woman. This assemblage series consists of 7 pieces in which 2 use images of Libby Paloma as the focal point, and the other 5 are significant family members. Particularly, the 2 assemblages that use photographs of Paloma are contrasting in their iconography and highlight different sides of her identity. Assemblage has a variety of definitions. It can refer to a collection of materials, a gathering of people, or a work that is made up of unrelated materials pieced together. Paloma explores all of these different definitions in her series. Chingana, aka Libby, uses a photograph of Paloma dressed in the Chola-style fashion she grew up wearing. Paloma interprets the word Chingana as badass woman. However, historically, this term has negative connotations in describing women who are, quote, too aggressive. Paloma is aware of this history and reclaiming this term by referencing it in her work. More often, women who are, quote, too aggressive are asserting themselves and living their lives on their own terms, rather than actually being too aggressive. She also demonstrates this powerful woman in her Chola fashion. Chola style has been tied to the Mexican-American subculture that is often associated with being criminal. Paloma adorns herself with this bold makeup, large chest tattoos, and exaggerated hoop earrings that are all popular in this Chola movement. While it has been misconstrued to be associated with an outlaw or criminal aesthetic, often by white people, Chola fashion is symbolic of feminism in the Chicanx community because it subverts traditional women's fashion and takes on these more masculine and powerful styles. Paloma is using Chingana and Chola to emphasize herself as a powerful, independent woman. She also incorporates iconography associated with free-spirited spaces and actions, such as cactus, beer bottles, a cassette, a guitar, and a shotgun crossing. These objects are representative of a form of a badass woman lifestyle in which she does what she wants. While it is traditionally frowned upon for women to drink beer or shoot guns, Paloma is aligning herself with these activities unapologetically and asserting that she can. The rainbow and the scissors can be a fun nod to her queerness. Rainbows are an established symbol for the LGBTQ+ community because the variety of colors are often a reflection of the diversity within the queer community. While not as explicit as the other objects, these are symbols that queer people have used to signal each other without being explicit, almost hinting at what you wouldn't know if you weren't part of this community. In naming this piece Chingana, aka Libby, Paloma is asserting herself as a badass woman and claiming that she is both herself and Chingana interchangeably. In contrast, Paloma included the Nacho, aka Paloma, assemblage in this series. This piece features a photograph of Paloma dressed in drag as her Nacho persona she has explored in her other works. Nacho is a cowboy that has a passion for Johnny Cash and keeping to the road of freedom. She uses Nacho as a comedic outlet and a performance character, but Nacho is also a chance to explore and highlight her masculine side. She incorporated this into her assemblage series in a way of sharing another piece of what you wouldn't know about the artist. One has to be familiar with her drag persona in order to fully understand this piece. And while drag is becoming more culturally acceptable, there is a sense of vulnerability in Paloma sharing this. She titles this piece again to remind us that she is both Paloma and Nacho interchangeably. She continues the shotgun iconography in this piece as to unite the two and emphasize the outlaw role of Nacho. Paloma has reflected that in creating these assemblages, there is an aspect of therapy that cannot be overlooked. It is extremely meticulous to create these hand-coiled ribbon roses. These roses have a strong connection to femininity in Mexico, often being on formal dresses, so Paloma may have been considering her femininity in contrast to Nacho while creating these roses. This piece is Paloma's reminder that she is both feminine and masculine interchangeably. Both of these pieces represent Libby Paloma as her whole self rather than a part of her. Both pieces emphasize her free spirit and outlaw identities that have encouraged her to live her life on her own terms. In choosing to create multiple pieces of herself, it is not breaking off individual pieces, but she uses these to expand how much she shares of herself. By highlighting lo que no sabrías, she is acknowledging that she is exploring these hidden selves and being vulnerable to share them. Paloma's work agentively displays what one wouldn't know about her in order to reveal her whole self. Manuel de Landa is a contemporary philosopher who has been theorizing about assemblages and their interconnectedness as being both part of something and an individual. Quote, if every assemblage can be termed a person, then every assemblage is made up of subpersonal components as well. End quote. Paloma draws on this assemblage theory in her piece by approaching these individual assemblages to be as strong as the series as a whole. Each piece serves as its own assemblage that uses a photograph and found materials to create a collage to tell a specific story that has affected Paloma's experience. In a set of the 5 other assemblages, Paloma shares her family history and highlights family members that have significantly impacted her. In turn, she reflects on how family is made up of individuals that create this unit larger than one. There's also an aspect in sharing her Mexican-American family that highlights what you wouldn't know about the Mexican-American experience. Paloma has commented how powerful it has been for her to share these family histories because these stories are so often overlooked and left out of the traditional American history. In reflecting on this series, she was most excited to see photographs of her family in a museum because it confirms that their existence has space in these institutions that have marginalized Chicanx and other Black, Indigenous people of color for so long. Paloma shows that an artist is intrinsically interconnected to their artworks and the messages that those artworks represent. She applies assemblage theory to reveal complex intersectional identities and how they are all connected and reliant on each other. Paloma uses the assemblages lo que no sabrías to piece together her identities through exploring herself as a queer Chicanx woman and her intimate familial relationships that form part of the diverse legacies of the Mexican-American experiences. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to share more about Libby Paloma's works.
Excellent. Another round of virtual applause for Chelsey Paige with this exciting overview of agency and self-representation and the fluidity of identity in Libby Paloma's work. So thank you so much, Chelsey, for sharing your work with us. And I also just want to highlight that UTC had the exciting honor of hosting Libby Paloma recently, thanks to the work of our UTC Foundation professors inviting Libby to talk. So it's exciting to see this come to fruition through further research on the artist here. And again, I'd also like to encourage those of you to add comments to the chat and to think of questions for our Q&A as we transition to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sydney Young, who comes to us from the University of Kentucky. Sydney will be sharing their paper, The MCR Cosplay Side of TikTok.
Hello, my name is Chelsey Paige, and
Oops, there we go. Well, I'll reread that title there. Sorry for the blurb interruption. So Sydney Young from the University of Kentucky will be sharing their paper with us entitled The MCR Cosplay Side of TikTok, Complicating Judith Butler's Ideas of Gender in the Age of TikTok. So let's welcome Sydney Young.
Hi, my name is Sydney Young, and today I'm going to be telling you about the My Chemical Romance cosplay side of TikTok, and how this complicates Judith Butler's ideas of gender in the social media age. In the context of the modern age of social media and prolific and constant performance of the self on digital platforms, the line between performance and real life is continually blurred, especially in the actual spaces constructed by social media. So these short posts on TikTok are not only fun videos in which to dress up as someone else for a minute, they also function as a window through which we can understand the ways that young people explore gender identity, and more specifically how young transmasculine people are using the safe space constructed on social media to perform and explore their gender, alternative masculinities, and the construction of their identities. So who is My Chemical Romance? So they were a popular emo band formed in 2001 that has maintained a fairly steady stream of popularity for years, even through a breakup and into today. The band, since their debut, has cultivated a strong visual language as evidenced by this photo, with strong thanks to cartoonist frontman Gerard Way, and that visual language has proven to be the perfect fodder for cosplay and performance, both in real life and now more recently on TikTok. And while the emo scene at large has been criticized for using the sensitive masculinity of the genre and the scene to reinforce the same heteropatriarchal mechanisms they pretend to drive against, My Chemical Romance has always deliberately created a safe space for marginalized youth, not only through their music, but through their real-life presence at shows, in person, and online. So there are a lot of My Chemical Romance cosplay TikToks floating around the internet, and in order to make any sort of sense of them or investigate them in any meaningful way, I elected to create a taxonomy of these videos, which is shown here. And I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about a couple of these categories that are most interesting. So the first category that I want to talk about is that of cosplay and closet cosplay. Now, this refers to users who create videos dressed up as and deliberately cosplaying as specific members of the band, complete with costume and makeup. These videos often consist of these users lip-syncing to songs by the band, or audio bites from interviews or other web content, which is perhaps the most formal in terms of degrees of performance. The difference between cosplay and closet cosplay is that closet cosplay refers to when a person creates a cosplay simply from everyday clothing items they may have in their closet. These are slightly less formal, but this style of cosplay allows for young teens on a budget to still participate in this community with what they may have on hand. The second category, and perhaps the most interesting, is the comedic category, in which users are making content with casual references to appropriating My Chemical Romance's style or aesthetics, even joking about the fans at large struggling with their personal nebulous gender identities. And this category is specifically interesting because of all the memes and jokes about being queer, intentionally or accidentally appropriating the style of or visuals of the band. And this implies an in-group, which is a group of people who knows and understands and enjoys all of the context behind a joke or a meme, and then they interact with the content that makes them laugh, or they agree with, or they want to share with friends. Some of these videos, as you can see here, have hundreds of thousands of likes. Even some comments have thousands of likes as well. And this is no small coincidence. It's a trend among thousands of users. And all of this, comedy, casual videos, all of the cosplay, all of this is a type of performance. Creating and posting and liking joke video content on social media is still an act of performance just as much as the cosplayers. And all of these videos together point to a spectrum of performance. While we can draw lines and create categories for taxonomies, each category bleeds through from one to the next. Some users who create cosplay videos also make meme content, and many acknowledge outright the act of imitation and transitioning into their real life. This idea of the online world affecting the real world is a more recent phenomenon, but it is also perhaps one of the most important aspects of culture and socialization in not only the social media age, but in the wake of a year of almost exclusively online interaction between young people. When internet community is some of the only community people have had access to. And the ambivalent nature of public and private on social media allows users to perform for a public with the intimacy of a private. As Eve Shapiro observes, internet affords a space in which one can interact with a multitude of anonymous others, offering a public arena where people feel they can privately engage in identity work. The internet allows people to try out, emphasize, and experience new or different aspects of their self, and that the very structure and features of the internet as text-based and anonymous make it an identity workshop. This very much expands upon Butler's ideas in Undoing Gender of technology as a site of potentiality. In this same work, she also mentions the separation of sex, gender, and gender performance, but through this taxonomy and through the lens of Eve Shapiro, you can see that there's ubiquity and inherent performativity of the self on all social media platforms. And if you relate that to fantasy and the interrelation of the online and offline self, you can see that these users on TikTok are using the platform as an identity workshop. The negotiation between real and online is not as black and white as digital versus analog. Online communities are just as real as in-person communities, and the self we construct on social media is not always completely distinct from the self we construct every day. Returning to Butler, as her theories relate to the spectrum of performances on TikTok, a repeated performance of the self on social media affects the repeated performance of the self in the world outside. The interrelation between the public self and the private self has served as the template for the production of the online self, just as much as the production of the online self can serve as a template for the offline self. The confidence a young person can gain from cosplaying as someone they admire and relate to on TikTok can give them the confidence to perform their more authentic self offline as well. Butler's notions of gender performance are extended to include the world of potentiality and fantasy in cosplay, the gendered performance on social media, the online and offline production of self, facilitated by the feminine and emotional masculinity of My Chemical Romance and fan culture. Hi, my name is Sydney Young.
Looks like we're experiencing a few technical difficulties, but our gracious host Adira is working on them.
Hi, my name is Sydney Young, and today by the feminine
and it looks like we're still working through some technicalities here. Okay, sorry. It looks like actually we reached the end of the video, so that is my mistake there. I thought it had cut off. But thank you so much for sharing your work with us, Sydney, and my apologies for there was just a glitch on my end, I think towards the end of the video. And so I want to thank you for highlighting the construction of the self through new emergent social media and through the lens of gender theory. Sydney. And it's exciting to see how TikTok is contributing to this discourse. And with that, I'm going to bring up our next guest. Our next presentation comes to us from Liana Salazar from LaSalle University, who is presenting on Toyo Miyatake and Japanese American internment camp photography. So with that, looks like we're just transitioning to the next video. And we'll welcome Liana as the video gets set up. Thank you for joining us, Liana.
Hello, my name is Liana Salazar, and today I will be presenting Toyo Miyatake and Japanese American internment camps. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order Number 9066 to have Japanese Americans sent to internment camps in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This was an unnecessary decision, however, as no person of Japanese descent was ever found guilty of espionage or treason against America during the war. Nevertheless, over 100,000 Japanese Americans along the West Coast were sent to internment camps. Among the internees was photographer Toyo Miyatake, who was sent to Manzanar. Miyatake was able to capture the rejection Japanese Americans felt, as well as a sense of community built in the internment camps with his photographs. When people see these photographs today, the empathetic response comes from an informed mind that understands the history of the image, while at the same time being moved by the images themselves. Before Miyatake's time in Manzanar, he was a prominent and active member of the Japanese American community. He opened Toyo Miyatake Studio in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles. He was a master with a camera, as evidenced in the several awards he won from salon competitions, so it was little wonder that the studio was successful. The Toyo Miyatake Studio was a popular place for people, including Japanese-American Hollywood actor Sasuya Hayakawa, to discuss anything from politics to the arts. In addition, Miyatake had many famous clients, including the famous author Thomas Mann and dancer Michio Ito. He was also a member of a group called the Shakudusha, a Japanese-American group dedicated to modernist art. Less glamorously to the Little Tokyo locals, Miyatake was the go-to man for special occasion photography, such as weddings and graduations. According to Alan, Miyatake's grandson, it is not uncommon for locals to tell him they have photos taken by his grandfather. That is really rewarding for me, he states, that they not only remember him and the studio, but they have trust in the studio that we will continue to do great work. This picture here depicts the 1941 Nisei Week Parade taken by Toyo Miyatake Studios. When Miyatake was told about Order 9066, he smuggled camera equipment without his family's knowledge, as he did not want to put them in danger. Photography was banned and cameras were confiscated, but Miyatake, in his own words, said, "This kind of thing should never happen again. I have to record everything." While inside Manzanar, he was able to convince a carpenter to make the remaining camera parts. After dark, Miyatake's photography captured the intimacy of camp life despite the absence of people. These photographs captured the feeling of imprisonment Miyatake felt. Despite being careful, Miyatake was quickly discovered. He was able to convince Manzanar director Ralph Merritt that documenting their lives was necessary, as Manzanar had the largest population between Los Angeles and Reno. Miyatake was then promoted to camp photographer with some rules. These rules being that a Caucasian person had to release the shutter, press the button, on everything he photographed, and all photos had to be pre-approved by Merritt. Nonetheless, Miyatake produced about 1,500 photographs while in Manzanar. Merritt valued Miyatake's photography as it not only would be documenting the residents, but he would be proving to the American public that Japanese Americans were being treated humanely. Both were important to Merritt, because he wanted to ease the tensions from a riot in the internment camp that broke out in December 1942, and because the US government needed to assuage the public's concerns over what the Japanese Americans were going through. They hired famous photographers such as Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange. Adams' pictures emphasize the positive aspects of life and mountainous landscapes around the camps with an overhead shot. Lange photographed the tragic reality by focusing on the most vulnerable of the camp, the ill, the old, and the children, in the isolating dusty desert. However, unlike these photographers, Miyatake was a resident of Manzanar. This was his community. He was taking photographs of people telling his own stories and their own stories, giving them agency to choose how they wanted to represent themselves. His subjects were similar to before internment: weddings, births, high school graduations, and daily life that would have gone otherwise unrecorded. Miyatake also photographed men who were drafted or volunteered for the war so that their families may hold on to pictures of them. He and a number of internees were also in charge of the high school yearbook. This small comfort gave residents a semblance of a normal life from before internment. These pictures were not only valuable because it showed the daily lives of residents, but it also captured people enjoying themselves in what was an otherwise hopeless situation. These were the moments people wanted to remember, and Miyatake made sure that they could. Over time, the rules regarding Miyatake's photography would loosen up, giving him the opportunity to photograph boys behind barbed wire. This is Miyatake's most well-known work. Though the photography itself is staged, the boys are actually outside of the internment camp while Miyatake photographs them from inside the internment camp. It is a powerful photograph. Previous photographers have characterized the internees as victims of the US government, but Miyatake complicates this image by creating his own strategy to represent themselves. He had no interest in victimizing his people by depicting the poor living conditions or maltreatment. He wanted to show that this was simply a heartbreaking situation Japanese Americans had found themselves in. Miyatake has positioned the camera at the three boys' levels as they watch the world from behind the barbed wire. They are all young and innocent, but this innocence is contrasted with the imposing presence of the guard tower in the background. Photographers like Lange and Adams were forbidden from taking pictures of the guard towers or barbed wire in photographs. Miyatake, though, under stricter rules, had access to these areas because he lived here. This positioning forces the communication of the injustice of the internment. How could the government treat innocent children like criminals? How could the government treat any of these innocent people like criminals? Since this picture was taken, Boys Behind Barbed Wire has become a symbol of Japanese American internment camps and the racial injustice in America. Today, efforts are being made to keep the next generation aware of the terrible legacy the US government left behind to Japanese Americans. Much of the evidence is captured in the photographs made by Toyo Miyatake. When people look at Toyo Miyatake's photography, the words that come to mind are community and restlessness. Miyatake felt that it was his duty to capture what happened in this period so that the public could be made aware and ensure this would never happen again. But even more, Miyatake refused to let himself capture only the sad moments. Yes, he captured some truly upsetting moments in the act of silent protest, but he did more than that. He took candid pictures of the small yet happy moments Japanese Americans experience in an otherwise heartbreaking situation. Unlike the other photographers, the personal, complex depth of feelings expressed through his photographs. This was Miyatake's life and his community, and this is how he chose both to be remembered by America. Any questions?
Another round of applause for Liana Salazar presenting this powerful piece on the work of Miyatake and shedding light on the unique perspective he brought through his photographic lens as both an artist and a victim of violence through this United States internment camp system. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And with that, we will transition to our last speaker for this panelist before we open up for comments and our Q&A for this session. And I'd like to welcome our speaker, Tacy Snyder, who comes to us from Covenant College and who will be presenting More Than Meets the Eye, W.E.B. DuBois and Gordon Parks.
More Than Meets the Eye, W.E.B. DuBois and Gordon Parks. Photography can provide us with the opportunity to see the world through another's lens, giving insight into their understanding of the world. Often, we look at photographs and expect simple truths, but in reality, photographers carefully choose and capture images with purposes and goals. To faithfully interpret photographs, one must look deeply, both at the photograph and at its historical and cultural context, rather than treating it simply as evidence of a moment. This certainly applies to images made during the Civil Rights Movement, when photography was used to prove the dark realities of Jim Crow in the South and provide access to subjects that were inaccessible to those outside the South. Civil rights photographers like Gordon Parks were heavily influenced by Black academics who came before them, like W.E.B. DuBois. As an intellectual, DuBois wrote on the Black American experience, specifically describing a concept he labeled double consciousness. While DuBois' term is conceptual, it describes a phenomenon that is worked out in tangible forms like photography. In this paper, I argue that the work of African-American photographer Gordon Parks visually wrestles with DuBois' concept of double consciousness. To understand the ways in which these ideas intersect, it is important to look at DuBois' concepts, the life of Gordon Parks, and a selection of his photographs that I've chosen, specifically those from in his 1956 Life magazine photo essay. DuBois describes his perception of the Black experience in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. He begins by acknowledging the fact that the Black man feels and understands himself to be a problem in each situation that he finds himself. DuBois goes deeper. He describes his experience as a hitch in the system and the profound effects that has on his psyche and his understanding of himself as a Black man. DuBois describes it as though he has been born with a veil that acts as a transparent barrier between himself and opportunity. Because of this veil, the Black man's socially fabricated understanding of himself suppresses him from living to his full potential. He names this experience of self double consciousness. The effects of having a double consciousness or a tangled identity weigh down on DuBois as this duality of Black American life creates heavy tension within man. But DuBois also understood the power of an image or photograph against the effects of double consciousness and the power of the veil. In the 20th century, photography was a central motivator, teacher, and conveyor of civil rights ideals because it could be used to combat the violent oppression of the South and reveal the horrific reality of life in the South for Black Americans. Gordon Parks is one of many Black photographers during the Civil Rights Movement. However, he began his career as a photographer outside the Civil Rights Movement in the fashion industry. In 1948, Parks was hired by Life magazine as their only Black photographer. His photographs take on a new dimension in light of W.E.B. DuBois' framework because Parks understands the Black experience and works to expand and validate the subjects of his photographs. In Robert Wallace and Gordon Parks' Life magazine photo essay in 1956, Parks visually creates an emotional connection between his majority white audience and the Thornton family, an impoverished Black family from Alabama. Each photograph provides deeper insight into the text and the reality that the text describes. The first picture in the photo essay depicts the central figures of the essay, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. Parks creates contrast in their position in the old portrait taken in their youth and their aged wizened attributes in their current position emphasize the historic struggle Parks is highlighting. Their eyes in both the old portrait and Parks' portrait gaze directly into the camera, piercing the audience, and by doing so, they look directly at the veil that exists between their lives and the wide audience of Life magazine. Parks' choice to represent them in this manner reveals his understanding of the vast expanse that lies between their world, described in the article, and the white world, content and unaware of the extensive nature of segregation. Parks' experience and understanding as a Black man who has wrestled with his own double consciousness seeks to validate the struggles of the Thornton family without limiting them to their struggles. Outside looking in records several of the Thorntons' great-grandchildren and their friends as they longingly stare at the playground for white children. On the other side of the fence, the grass seems greener and the playground equipment appears more enticing than anything they can access. Here, DuBois' Vale is physically represented by the chain-link fence. Parks captures this scenario to elicit empathy for the young children who are kept out merely because of their skin color. From a young age, these children face the consequences of segregation. The composition of this photograph metaphorically represents every situation these children will face if change is not made in the system. Parks uses this composition to capture the extent of segregation in the lives of this family, which represents everyone living under Jim Crow laws and segregation. E.J. Thompson, Tennessee professor and member of the Thornton family, stands with his family as they prepare to enter the colored waiting room. This moment exemplifies DuBois' double consciousness, as Professor Thornton, a man of intellect and science, is forced to maintain the status quo that demands he lower himself. Parks chooses to photograph this occasion, which he places in contrast with photographs of Professor Thornton teaching and among other professors, to emphasize the immeasurable effects of segregation. Professor Thornton comes face to face with his own double consciousness as he participates in the American world that consistently tells him he is less than he is. Within the photo essay, this image closes the essay. Parks leaves the audience with this image to impress upon them the ways that his people are waiting. As the Thorntons move towards the waiting room designed for colored people, so too do the rest of the black people in the South wait for equality. They are tired and frustrated as they struggle with their own double consciousnesses. Yet, through all these struggles, Parks works to capture their dignity and create art that not only elicits empathy, but also reaffirms a people in their identity and visually chants for freedom in its rejection of the status quo. Parks' dignity is present throughout his photographs as he has wrestled with his own double consciousness and come to the conclusion that he will be himself regardless of social pressures around him. His photographs take on a new dimension in light of DuBois' framework describing the Black experience. In a similar way that DuBois sought to create unity within a people and empathy within the broader community by further explaining the Black lived experience in America, Parks also uses his art to expound his audience's comprehension of life through the camera lens of a Black man. Parks works hard to create art that not only elicits empathy, but that also reaffirms a people in their identity and visually chants for freedom in its rejection of the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tacy. Another round of applause for this a very powerful presentation, building on our discussion of photography and the perspective of Gordon Parks, as well as the artist's use of the camera as a tool for social justice. So many thanks. And with that, I would love to invite all of our speakers back on, so we will have the opportunity to dive deeply into thinking about the research that they contributed here today and open up to questions. So it looks like we're transitioning back in here into bringing our students back onto the main screen. So we'll just make sure that everybody can come on board here. And I would like to take this opportunity to also remind our listeners to be ready with some questions in the chat as we transition to opening up to the Q&A with a few comments to prepare us for our questions and inviting us to reflect on these common threads that emerge throughout these papers. So I'd just like to begin again by extending a hearty congratulations to all of our presenters today who have worked so diligently and creatively as young scholars to share their original research with us. Each of your presentations offer us powerful frameworks for reflection, from the crafting of gender to addressing issues of trauma, resistance, and racism by this array of artists in the work that you've shared with us today. With their distinct foci, all of these papers come together to shed complex nuance and complementary insights on diverse dimensions of identity. The ideas of key theorists are astutely interwoven across your research papers today. And these are tied perceptively together, pieced together in relationship to our theme, to reveal the role of the self-construction of identity as a key thread. Sidney Young points us to the work of American philosopher and gender theorist Judith Butler as foundational for us in terms of illustrating the construction of identity, particularly gender identity, as a performative act. Young's close reading of My Chemical Romance cosplay performance in TikTok provides us with introspective insights on the manner in which the internet and emergent forms of social media serve as a critical platform for the exploration of gendered identities, particularly transmasculine and queer identities, as Young revealed to us today. Their research dovetails constructively with that of Chelsey Paige. Paige's exploration of the artistic production of Latinx artist Libby Paloma highlights the manner in which the artist's work explores both her feminine and masculine self via representations of the rebel persona of the chingona and the cowboy nacho. Reading the multimedia material and interdisciplinary performative aspects of Paloma's work through the theory of Mexican-American Manuel de Landa's Assemblaged, Paige introduces how individual components of the artist's identity are revealed and or concealed through fluid processes of coding, decoding, and recoding via linguistic and material artistic processes. Expanding on these frameworks, Ellie Fitzgerald invites us to consider the transmaterial expressions of cultural identity, as well as issues of trauma and violence that may be encoded within them. Fitzgerald invites us to consider the work of Navajo artist Susan Hudson and reconsider the gendered artistic discourse surrounding quilt making as a passive, decorative genre. Fitzgerald powerfully highlights how quilt making, often associated with, as she stated, white harmless femininity, a key point, in fact, was a tradition imposed upon Indigenous peoples of North America through colonialism, and thereby is intertwined with legacies of colonial violence. Reading the materiality of Hudson's quilt as the embodiment of intersectional violence impacting Indigenous peoples and women, Fitzgerald notes that the critical discourse surrounding quilt making as an artistic form must shift in order to include Indigenous voices and colonial critiques, and advocates for a transmaterial reading of the medium as a way forward. Further addressing histories of violence impacting the work and lives of people of color, Liana Salazar's research sheds important light on the powerful and unique insights offered through the lens of Toyo Miyatake as both an artist and an inmate of Manzanar's Japanese internment camp. Salazar emphasizes the manner in which Miyatake's lens captured the experience of innocent Japanese Americans unjustly imprisoned in these camps with a personal complexity and depth in a manner that contemporary photographers Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange were unable to do. Noting Adams' commissioned idealized photos of the camps and Lange's documentary focus on the inherent justice, Salazar reveals how Miyatake's lens did not victimize, but rather chose to frame these individuals interned at the camp through everyday stories, portraying portraits of everyday courage and resilience within this inherently unjust chapter in the history of the United States. Tacy Snyder's research on the photography of Gordon Parks builds on this powerful perspective, noting how artists, highlighting an artist whose lived experience of daily discrimination due to the color of their skin critically paved the way forward for social discussion and change. Looking to W.E.B. Du Bois' landmark text, The Lives of Black Folks, Snyder highlights the manner in which Parks' photographs of African Americans living in the segregated South was informed by his own experience of double consciousness. As a Black artist and the first photographer of the Times magazine, Snyder sheds light on Parks' use of the camera as a strategic tool to confront racism and draw awareness to the imposing oppression of the veil of discrimination. Together, these papers provide us with a rich tapestry of diverse works, issues, and artists, and critical foundations through which we can continue to explore the complex negotiations of identity and powerful perspectives of self-representation through these artists' work. So with these thoughts in mind, I'd love to give one last round of applause to our presenters for sharing their thought-provoking research. And we will open up to a Q&A. So thank you all so much for sharing your powerful work with us. It has been an absolute delight to encounter these artists and these critical issues that you've all brought forward so beautifully and are in dialogue with each other in such rich and interconnected ways. So again, I'm going to remind our audience that we have our chat box here, and we are excited to hear any thoughts. This can range from general comments on observations to the papers or questions that you might have. And as we wait for a few questions to filter in, I might propose one question to all of you, because we had thought, your papers weave together these issues of self, the construction of the self so strongly. And so I was curious, and some of your papers bring up this, but maybe this is an opportunity to expand. We see in the artist's work that you highlight here today, modes of resistance against discrimination or against frameworks of self imposed on one due to social constructions. I'm wondering if in your research, and this is a question to all of you again, if in your research you encountered resistance by outside institutions to this artist's production because of the way that they were challenging modes of self-presentation or addressing issues tied to social justice. So again, my question is, how might the artists or individuals that you looked at today, might they have encountered resistance? Did they encounter resistance to their work through institutions or other modes, maybe the audience or a critical response? And so I might, I'll just kind of call on each of you as we wait for more questions or comments to come through in the chat. And maybe I'll begin with you, Tacy, since we just ended with your work. How might Gordon Parks have encountered resistance, if so, if you were able to uncover that in your research?
Yes, so because of his role as a Life magazine photographer, the resistance would have been different because he was hired to photograph these things. And so his art was used in that context. So in that case, I didn't find as much resistance directly to him as much as the overall Southern objection to the abuses of segregation.
Okay. Thank you for pointing that out. That's really interesting to think about these works also within a commission, so that there was, at least through the Times magazine, a support system through that particular magazine. And it might be interesting to kind of consider whether there were responses to the publication of those images, maybe you might be able to see, through future publications if there was a critical response. But it's really interesting to think about, the commission being also very important and Parks being able to tell that story. And I wonder, also kind of going in the reverse flow of the papers, maybe I'll pose that question to you, Liana. Were there modes of resistance to Miyatake's work being shown. Of course, he's also an artist who was literally interned in the camp. So that itself is
that was a pretty
extreme challenge.
way to push back on him, especially since it was illegal. But there was a riot in December of that same year he was caught, I believe.
Wow.
So they were like, okay, maybe we can use him as a way to kind of keep everyone else calm. It'll both keep the basically prisoners happy and calm, and it'll calm the public's fears about like what's going on in here. Obviously, he had the rules about only white people could actually like press the button to take the pictures, but he could take pictures of whatever he pleased if he could find a way. So there was a lot of resistance, but he found a ways around it. So
yeah, it's really fascinating. It was my first time hearing about this rule that was imposed on him for, pressing the button, the actual camera shutter in order to take the photograph. So it's very fascinating to consider, as you point out, that he had to negotiate eventually, if I understand correctly, for that limitation to be removed. He always was able to negotiate a way to take his photographs, if I understand correctly.
Mm-hmm. And the people who were assigned to like take the pictures for them, for whatever reason, they quit within a few months. So they usually had to be like, oh, we can't take pictures today. There's no photographer available. So eventually Merritt, the director, just hired a bunch of wives of the guards and said, here, if you can do this, you can get paid. And that worked around for most part. So.
Wow, that is really fascinating to hear about. That is fascinating. So that the person taking the shutter, doing the actual shutter release, those who were contracted in that role did not stay long in that role, and then ultimately Miyatake was able to have somewhat more freedom. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. And let's hear now from Sydney Young. If you could also share maybe some resistance that you encountered in your work on TikTok and cosplay. How might some of the individuals who are self-presenting through TikTok have encountered resistance, if that is something that you were able to see through your research?
Of course. So a lot of the sort of aspects of these TikToks include a lot of subcultures. So cosplay is a sort of subculture, sort of nerd culture, the emo music scene as well. While it was popular amongst, people who enjoyed the music, it was never fully mainstream, and like maybe a little bit in the early 2000s. And so a lot of the resistance that I encountered, or a lot of the resistance that, these young people would have encountered, would have been largely societal, because they're functioning sort of as queer people and as young people under a lot of societal structures and a lot of expectations. You don't have a lot of autonomy when you're young and when you're exploring, who you are. I will say, as a sort of side note, that a lot of the videos that I collected were largely from white kids. So I do want to acknowledge that sort of racial bias there. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to be young, and it's hard to be young and queer, and it's hard to be young, queer, and trans, and also on the internet. So I feel very fortunate that these kids were able to sort of find a small community with which they can share videos to each other, because that's the sort of nice thing about algorithms, is that especially on TikTok, these videos wouldn't be seen by anyone who would be like in stark opposition. I mean, chances are, if you're seeing this, you're already sort of predisposed to like it. So I feel like these kids have been very fortunate in their sort of construction of their identities.
That is so fascinating to hear more about. Thank you so much, Sydney, for your work. It was really beautiful reading of this genre, this new media of TikTok through this academic theory, the lens of gender theory, especially through Butler's work. So that was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
And I'd like to, again, just continue posing the question, and then we'll move to some great questions that I see we already are getting in the chat. So that's fabulous. Thank you so much for those of you who are posting in the chat for us. I'll turn our question about resistance to Chelsey. Do you know if Paloma encountered resistance to their work, and if, and how maybe the artist might have responded?
I don't know necessarily much of the resistance. Being a Chicanx woman in America is a resistance in of itself, but something that she did note that I thought was beautiful was she talked about how in the Assemblaged series as a whole, having these images of her family who are typically like lower paid workers displayed in a museum was just, that's like the most empowering, and it's really a big movement for her to get to share that with her, like to finally see actual like Mexican Americans in museum institutions and real people was like a really big deal for her. So I thought that was really sweet.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. Both your work and Sydney's work really have this great dialogue going on in terms of resistance, in terms of visibility, right? Visibilizing oneself through media, whether it be the TikTok media or these assemblages, this act of visibilizing oneself as a resistance to the marginalization of certain identities within broader society. So I think that's a very powerful thread that comes together there.
I would also say Liana's is also kind of interconnected in that way, that sharing these everyday experiences and bringing like actually representing people of color as their daily lives was really awesome.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Chelsey, as well. Yeah, and Liana's and Tacy's, I can see that too. All of these are beautifully interwoven in that sense. And we'll turn over to Ellie before we open up to the chat. If you could also share a little bit more about how the artists may have encountered resistance, and you do address this to a certain extent with the issue of institutions, but it'd be lovely to just hear you expand more on this.
Yeah, thank you. Personally, I did not find any actual evidence of an institution being resisting to her artwork and her quilt art. But what I find so interesting about her evolution as an artist is that she really anticipated this resistance, and she tried to cater her work to it first. And then with her, as I mentioned, she was creating quilts later in her life because she was creating them to make money, really, and she was using the Lakota star, even though she's of Navajo heritage, because that's what would sell. And yeah, so she was really just anticipating what would sell. She was anticipating what the imposed framework of herself should be, and then only later, when she was prompted, did she really figure out, oh, I can be an artist too. She was a quilter first, and then she was an artist. So she anticipated the resistance, and then she really bloomed out of it. And I've only been looking at indigenous sources and indigenous, reactions to her work, and they're all positive. So if there are people out there who don't like her work,
Well, that's frankly encouraging, though. I think your point of the anticipated resistance that Susan Hudson, that you sensed in the production of the artist's work, this anticipation of resistance, first catering to tastes, and then slowly realizing this media was a way that the artist could address, these deeper societal issues. The legacy of genocide is really powerful. So it's interesting. I'm happy that you didn't encounter any anything institutional in your research so far. It might be interesting to see if there might be some critical reactions to some of the shows that you do cite as going in a new direction of discourse, like the G's Ben Quilt show. And I think your point about transmateriality as a way forward is very exciting. So I applaud you in opening up that discourse. And now I'm going to activate this chat here. I'm going to go through because I saw some great comments. And we have a comment here from Professor Katie Hargrave. Thank you for joining us, Professor Hargrave. It's really exciting to have you with us. And it looks like the comment is, I think the comment here is to Tacy. It looks like Professor Hargrave notes, it would be interesting to see what the editorial process was within Life magazine. So that is an excellent point. it looks like the comment also goes on to ask about the pieces of parks, if you know about any pieces of parks, if they were selected for publication or which ones were not. Let me reread that because I think I misspoke a bit with the framing of the question. So Professor Hargrave asks, I would love to know which pieces of parks were selected for publication and which were not. And so maybe you don't know the answer to this, but if you have any insights you might be able to offer, that would be great. Or maybe it could be a new direction to explore.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't think about. In comparison with the Gordon Parks Foundation website and the Life magazine archives of the article, I can't recall seeing any photographs that were in the foundation that were not in the article. So I would love to explore that further and see what did or didn't make it. That's a wonderful perspective.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. It might also be interesting, kind of building on Professor Hargrave's point. I wonder what maybe some editorial choices might be with regards to cropping images. That might also be really interesting with regards to how the stories could be reframed in certain ways potentially. So that is exciting. That could be an exciting opportunity to do some archival research, perhaps. So that's great. And so several people are commenting on that. All right. It sounds like we are, in the interest of time, moving on to our next set of presenters. So I will just offer one last round of applause to all of you and compliment you for your exciting research. And we'll look forward to this next panel coming up.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our second half of our panel. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our four speakers that we have in the second group. But first, I do want to say that thank you so much to the first 5 students who presented. It was wonderful papers, and I'm really excited to have a dialogue with the 4 papers that we hear in this second session. One thing that struck out to me is that so much of the papers in that first group were dealing with the materiality and how the materiality of the artwork worked towards building an identity. And one thing that I think we'll see in the second group is that there really becomes much more of a subjective engagement. So I'm really excited to share with you the work of Olivia Harrell, Lisa Ashley Hill, Cecilia Dixon, and also Chase Williamson. We are going to begin with the work of Olivia Harrell, who is from Kennesaw State, and we will hear the paper Race as a Social Construct, stitching memorial architecture with subterranean tunnel systems of the slave trade. Everyone, please give a big round of applause for Olivia Harrell.
More than 100 years ago, African-American activist, scholar, global citizen, sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois was concerned that race was being used as a biological explanation for what he understood to be a social and cultural difference between different populations of people. The racial worldview was essentially invented to assign some groups to perpetual lower status, while others were permitted access to privilege, power, and wealth. The notion of racial identity, as argued by Du Bois, is essentially a social construct to classify people. This issue, stated by Du Bois, is exemplified by many laws that once existed within the American government and historical events that took place. We can also see racial issues within architectural design and urban planning. Since the ruling of the Buchanan and Warley case, urbanism created racial separation in American cities. Plan is politics. Social objectives have forever been at the center of early planning. Although the South invented and made wide use of racial zoning, the region relied on Northern planning consultants to devise legally defensible ways to segregate Black residential areas. Another example of this would be the design of and the use of tunnel systems during the transatlantic slave trade within America. In Savannah, Georgia, solitary confinement within a subterranean tunnel system forced slaves to take on a new racial identity. It is proven that after only 5 days of solitary confinement, the psychological framework of a human being is destroyed. These tunnels were devices used to remake the human being. My paper seeks to shed new light on the concept of racial identity as a way of understanding Savannah's historical African and Haitian culture, revealing the importance of the existence of the subterranean tunnel system. Savannah's historical urban plan is one of the most studied within urban design. However, there is a subterranean urban fabric, this tunnel system, that aided in the holding and transportation of slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. These cold, dark, wet tunnels begin at the bluff of the Savannah River and run about 8 miles beneath the city. Due to the 30-foot change in elevation from the bluff to the mainland, transporting goods and slaves was difficult. The tunnel system were used to transport slaves from the slave ships to their holding quarters and then to their slave auction sites. This tunnel system is a part of a horrific room that demands re-evaluation within the current socio-political climate of the United States. Savannah's urban plan was designed to connect people in space, but due to the enslavers' immoral rulings, Savannah's urban plan failed to connect the African and Haitian cultures that aided in the city's creation and survival. The current African American population in Savannah makes up about 60% of the city's population. However, there are only 2 national monuments and 1 civil rights center within the city that commemorates the African American or African or Haitian heritage of the people that dwell in not only the historic district, but within Savannah-Chatham County alone. My investigation birthed a new idea for a memorial center that will commemorate and pay homage to the people, the slaves who suffered and died in Savannah. Imagine a design where you see yourself walking down the streets of downtown Savannah, where the pavement is peeling away in transition, revealing this disruption in these very dungeon-like tunnels as a well-choreographed memorial depicting the very essence of the enslaved as if it was present day. This memorial shall become not only a physical marker, but also an experience transcending time and place, locally, domestically, and internationally. It is important to create a physical acknowledgement, remembering a hidden space, to understand the mechanisms of inequality. With the use of urban design and memorial architecture, the tunnels and their existence will be revealed for everyone to see, to piece together racial and social identities with the use of architecture and design. We must never forget. I agree with architect David J. when he said, "You have to make slavery a part of what you are. The act has happened. History has happened. You can't remove that." This memorial will give the slaves back their identity, which was once lost and forgotten.
Thank you so much for that incredibly powerful paper. I think that that just by judging from all the excitement in the chat, that there's a lot of positive response and this reclaiming of subjectivities that the stitching memorial brings about. We're going to continue to hear more about subjectivities in our next paper by Lisa Ashley Hill, which is entitled "The Invitation of Untitled, I Am Somebody."
Whether
Hello, my name is Lisa Hill, and I'll be presenting on Glenn Ligon's painting entitled "I Am Somebody." African-American conceptual artist Glenn Ligon's Untitled I Am Somebody is one of several text paintings from his Door series. Completed in 1991, each painting contains short appropriated statements from various Black prominent figures. Untitled I Am Somebody is a text painting on a life-size door-shaped canvas, and the surface is fully covered with Black gesso stenciled words. Written in the first-person perspective, the declaration I am somebody is pressed along the length of the canvas, falling oftentimes mid-word onto the next line where the proclamation continues. After a few lines, the statement repeats on the canvas and the stencil begins to build up with dark gesso. Charcoal is also spread against the white canvas, causing the words to smudge and become an indecipherable black mass. As our eyes strain to read the text, the viewer also wonders, who is this I that is declaring I am somebody? In using no specific subject or body, Glenn Ligon creates a painting that asserts identity in a way that is both personal and simultaneously universal. An example of a painting specifically tied to Glenn Ligon's own identity is his Untitled I Am a Man. This painting, similar to Untitled I Am Somebody, appropriates text. Untitled I Am Somebody, the quote originates from politician and civil rights activist Jesse Jackson. In Untitled I Am a Man, the statement comes from 1968 march in Memphis, where Black male sanitation workers peacefully protested while holding signs that read in all caps, I am a man. While both paintings are similar because they take text from previous sources, I Am a Man is more intimate to Ligon. Eve Ellen Boyce, a professor of art history at the School of Historical Studies at Princeton University, calls paintings such as these a transfer, meaning the drawing or painting serves as a map to another surface. Untitled I Am a Man looks identical to the posters made by the sanitation workers. Therefore, when we see Ligon's painting, we also envision a Black man using it. We do not need to wonder what type of man Ligon is referring to. The Black male body is implied. Comparatively, in Untitled I Am Somebody, Ligon repeats the famous avowal declared by Jesse Jackson in settings ranging from civil rights protests to the set of Sesame Street. Ligon chooses to use only a portion of what Jackson says, enabling him to control the amount of information we receive. In recordings of Jesse Jackson's speech, he says, I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody. In Jesse Jackson's speech, he tells us the type of person we should consider somebody, while in Ligon's artwork, it is up to the viewer to interpret the marginalized persons he is referring to. The omission of Jackson's words by Ligon broadens the meaning of the statement and adds to its impact. And pointing to no one in particular, he opens the conversation to everyone. By solely using text, Ligon demonstrates the struggle of not fitting into societal standards. He intentionally chooses to make the words not fit into the line perfectly, allowing them to split into fragments. As a new line begins, each line differs from the last. And in doing this, Ligon is making the text stand in place of the human form. The widely renowned art curator, critic, and historian, Okwe and Weiser says, the use of text rather than human form to project figurative questions and representations allows Ligon to maintain the complexity of his critical address. The omission of Jackson's words and the use of text are both strategic on Ligon's part. In his painting, Untitled I Am a Man, the viewer is more satisfied as he clarifies an aspect of his identity. However, in Untitled I Am Somebody, the lack of information allows the viewer to fill in the blank. We are able to insert ourselves. In summary, Untitled I Am Somebody is personal and generous. While it is still an assertion of the artist's identity, he creates space for others to be included. The painting creates a meaningful experience to a diverse audience. In turn, the viewer, no matter the background, goes from wondering who the I in I Am Somebody is to reciting it to themselves in a therapeutic way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that wonderful paper. And I'm sorry that I neglected to mention that you are from Covenant College here in the region. I do want to make sure that I give that proper acknowledgement. I think your paper hits on a wonderful theme that speaks about the idea of the artist's identity versus the viewer's identity. And that's a theme that we'll continue to hear on in our next paper, and by Cecilia Dixon. And the title of this paper is going to be Kelly as an Assemblage, excuse me, is going to be Mike Kelly's the Banana Man as personification of childhood, as a personification of childhood. Everyone please give a nice round of applause for for Cecilia Dixon from UMass.
I'm Cecilia Dixon, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Mike Kelly and his interpretation of identity. So to center Mike Kelly as an artist wholly interested in what he calls repressed memory syndrome and how this shapes adult identity, I would like to begin with a quick discussion of repressed memory syndrome and a quote from Kelly himself. Though widely debated in the psychological field, repressed memory syndrome refers to a trauma response in which one attempts to maintain, quote, psychological equilibrium by unconsciously blocking a traumatic memory. Kelly extends and shifts this idea away from physical trauma and instead looks at amnesia pertaining to childhood as a whole, saying, quote, I'm not interested in remembering anything. There's not much to remember anyway. My biography is fairly dull. It is much better to fill in these empty spaces with fiction than the boring truth. I filled in the blanks with pastiches of things that had affected me when I was a child. Cartoons, films, and the kinds of horrible stories one finds in the literature of repressed memory syndrome. I just mixed all that up. Though Kelly claims that the mundane aspects of his biography are embellished with elements borrowed from his childhood, Kelly's identity turns into an assemblage of childhood memories, making the pastiches just as representative of the artist as his true biography. By investigating two of Kelly's works, Banana Man and Brown Star, we can see that to Kelly, adult identity is a result of childhood engagements, toys, and memories discarded into the farthest recesses of our minds. Banana Man and Brown Star are physical and conceptual stand-ins for Kelly's childhood and ultimately his adult identity. In 1982, Mike Kelly presented his first completed video work, The Banana Man, in which he attempted to recreate a television character from his youth that he had admittedly never witnessed. The original Banana Man, shown on screen, was a product of the children's television show series Captain Kangaroo that ran for 29 seasons starting in 1955. Captain Kangaroo's Banana Man featured an operatic clown, reaching into his pockets for an endless supply of tricks and, well, bananas. Kelly built his interpretation of the Banana Man off of childhood hearsay, transforming himself into what he believed the character to be, perhaps more of a visualization of Kelly's own childhood than a faithful depiction of the titular role. While the Banana Man is an early addition to Kelly's oeuvre, it aptly foreshadows his later work and dedication to themes of childhood memories, material consumption, and collections. The entirety of Mike Kelly's Banana Man consisted of a 28-minute video, several hand-drawn character studies, and a photograph of Kelly in costume as the main character. The video, like much of Kelly's work, has long been archived and is only viewable during rare screenings, so I have chosen to focus on the photograph in one of Kelly's character drawings. One of the only existing portraits of Kelly as the Banana Man features the artist leaning against a bass drum, legs crossed playfully. He smirks at the camera outfitted in a pocket-covered yellow sailor suit and a Dixie cup of the same hue. A single ringlet of brown hair dangles over Kelly's brow, the youthful cut suspending Kelly in a limbo between childhood and adulthood. This portrait of the Banana Man introduces us to multiple facets of Kelly's interpretation of identity. His childlike appearance alludes to a fascination with childhood musings and misinterpretations as a building block for our adult selves. The classic sailor's hat is an ode to his soon-to-be interest in kitsch and consumerism. His abundance of pockets reference themes of collecting and guarding items. The Banana Man is a personification of childhood experiences and memories, and by playing the role himself, Kelly declares his place as an individual, conceived almost entirely of the ghost of his youth. In this image, we see Kelly's conceptualization of the Banana Man. He asks, why does the Banana Man decide on a life of entertaining children? And answers his own question with the response, on the contrary, he had nothing to do with the decision. Kelly also scrolls across the page several other related thoughts, such as children drawn together by a collective feeling of torture, a common feeling, a collective thought. Kelly's Banana Man isn't deciding to entertain children. The children are deciding that he will entertain them. Our childhood memories are shaped by our peers to form what we ultimately become. The Banana Man, or an amalgamation of childhood. 10 years later, Mike Kelly's Brown Star, staged in Jeffrey Deitch's post-human exhibition, also grapples with childhood identity, but extends to focus on matters of both materiality and materialism. Brown Star features 6 hanging masses constructed out of stuffed animals, each one a slightly different tone of tan. Kelly positions the animals in an embrace, their tails, ears, and ribbons protruding from the masses. The discarded stuffed animals comfort each other, hanging tight so as to avoid being turned into garbage. One orb features a monkey, dangling, afraid to let go and drop on the sterile gallery floor. Deitch presents Kelly as conflating humans and animals, presenting an uneasy confusion of artificiality, innocence, and bestiality. In separate instances, Kelly regards the stuffed animal as a stand-in for both the parent and the child. In Playing with Dead Things, Kelly identifies the stuffed animal as a child's first not-me possession, an object that is essentially a stand-in for the mother. In a discussion about his piece, Eviscerated Corpse, Kelly remarks that to him, the stuffed animal is a pseudo-child, a cutified sexless being which represents the adult's perfect model of a child, a neutered pet. Kelly's positioning of the stuffed animal as both a child and an adult draws on the fine line between the two states of being. We are not so different from our childhood selves. Whether adult or child, the stuffed animals remain in their desperate embrace. While in The Banana Man, Mike Kelly creates a character made out of childhood memories, Brown Star presents the idea in sculptural form, confronting the viewer with a physical mass made out of the polyester remnants of childhood and conflating adult and child in the process.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I love how at the end you delve into such a complicated psychology of these objects. And I think that this idea of psychology is a theme that we're going to be talking about throughout all these papers. And specifically in our final paper of the day, which is going to be by Chase Williamson and of UTC, who will be presenting on the preconceptions of identity. Everyone, please give a warm of applause for Chase.
I'm Cecilia Dick.
Hi, my name is Chase Williamson, and the first thing that I'd like to do is ask you a question. Suppose you imagine a wide field of flowers. Do you associate them all as being of the same category, growing from the same genus in one singular stem? No, you think of an array of different sorts of florets, all with different colors, purposes, and styles, all with their own unique appearance. This analogy mirrors my own, as I strive to create an atmosphere that tears down the preconceived notions that surround people of color. In my approach to art making, I pull inspiration from many artists, one of the most prominent figures being Amy Sherald. I actively look to her insightful artistic process because of how she masterfully portrays unexpected narratives in her art. And through that, she invites viewers to engage in a more nonconformist debate surrounding the conversations of race and representation. I was specifically drawn to this viewpoint that it's okay to portray and paint something that doesn't coincide with what's traditionally expected. Amy Sherald deliberately paints her black figures in a cool, dark hue that is void of warm saturation. She depicts her portraits this way for the artistic discussion to not revolve around the traditional portrayal of what's considered beauty. I remember being fascinated when I was introduced to her artwork because at the time I'd never really seen artwork that painted black skin tones in this muted way. Perhaps Sherald's most popular artwork is Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, which was created in 2018. Because it was of the former First Lady, it of course went viral around that time. Michelle's portrait was uniquely rendered, and being painted by a black female artist made it an even more significant commission. At a glance, many thought that her artwork circled racial history or had something to do with the Black Power artistic movement. But this kind of misconception is actually a goal of hers. While one of Sherald's objectives is to highlight the beauty that exists within black people, Sherald doesn't put that conversation at the top of her list. I believe that Sherald desires for the art discussion to swirl deeper than that, to address the present issues of racial identity. The most recent painting that she did of Breonna Taylor is, without a doubt, awe-strikingly beautiful. But the meaning of Breonna Taylor is not just supposed to surround her beauty. It's supposed to be an outcry of the racial injustice that keeps prevailing and showing its face in our society. Sherald says that she decided to go with turquoise for both the dress and the background because it allows the audience to focus on the emotions in her face. That monochromatic usage allows the audience to focus on her identity as a person. Sherald said that she wanted the image to stand as a piece of inspiration to keep fighting for justice for both Brianna and for our community. Cheryl makes a poignant effort to make the portrait not just about the pain or her technicality, but about the possible identity that person holds. What furthermore makes her work so compelling is that she connects her work to American realism by portraying her subjects with that gray-toned skin in order for that art discussion to be about each individual's unique identity, not solely about race, although this is an integral component of her paintings. As a result, she created blackness without the gaze of whiteness. This white gaze essentially traps Black people in white imaginations. And so, by creating artwork that doesn't depend on the approval of the white audience, Cheryl is deconstructing the white gaze and demonstrating how she makes sure that the white gaze is not the dominant figure of motivation. The purpose behind Cheryl's canvas is to portray a composition where the focus isn't immediately set on one stereotypical expected idea. Instead, she works to create unexpected narratives that allow the audience to engage in conversations that don't always coincide with the typical representations of race and ethnicity. In other words, she actively strays away from what the audience presumes is the meaning of the painting. One work in particular that I've been influenced by is pictured here, titled The Make-Believer, Monet's Garden, which she painted in 2016. Her delicate usage of floral strongly translates to my own incorporation of nature and flowers. I can compare this to a piece I painted around this time last year, titled Known. My main intention behind the painting was that I wanted people to look at the subject's identity, rather than just his skin. Similar to Cheryl's intentions, I wanted to paint a portrait where you can feel the abstruseness through his eyes, something that communicates to the viewer feelings of somberness. I wanted to, in a way, reject the stereotypical imagery placed on African American subjects that we've seen time and time in the past, and instead replace it with a new interpretation about what identity can mean. By placing the Black subject in a composition that hasn't stereotypically and or historically been associated with it, I attempt to challenge harmful racial cues. My work is motivated by this prejudiced portrayal of Black people in past and contemporary traditional media portrayals, and in turn is a reintroduction of Black bodies surrounded by objects and scenery that modify our perception of beauty. I do this by intentionally adding that usage of nature, whether it be trees, a garden, a body of water, or a wide, vivid field of flowers. I do this for the audience to see that Black skin can and should exist in the same atmosphere with something as soft as nature. My painting pictured here, Vibrant Springtime, encapsulates that ideology. My art is a proud and loud rejection of the old ingrained lenses that have captivated our society. Identity is righteously distinct for every single person. We all have a complex, inexplicable identity, and it wouldn't make sense to automatically perceive and judge a person because of their outside appearance. Theorist Stuart Hall is another figure from whom I draw influence. I look to his theories of how our cultural identity is not only a matter of being, but of becoming as well. Racial issues are the fuel to his contemporary art, as it's pushed him to reflect on how our cultural identities are not predetermined and set. Instead, our identities are continuing to be open to modification as we grow and experience the world differently. I take great inspiration from his ideas, because I too believe that we all have complex, diverse identities that should not be confined to a set of preconceived ideas. Our identity is ever evolving and unique to each person, no matter their race or ethnicity, and it would be absurd to classify a person just because of their skin color. Our skin is not a precursor to what lies within our identity. I have personally felt the burden and the weight of what it feels like to be categorized, to feel like I'm automatically shut into a preconceived frame just because of the color of my skin. But those ignorant prejudices are not the truth. Black skin is something that can be firm and strong, but at the same time it can be delicate and sophisticated. It should be celebrated and seen as a glorious entity with not one singular identity. Like Cheryl, I want my art to converse the topic of representation around the African American body because there is divine beauty that lives within all of us. Through her art, Cheryl indicates how an artist can play a transformative role in bringing more equity to a community, and that is what I hope to create as well in my own paintings. Her pathway coincides with my own, and that the common goal for our art is to communicate subject matter that strays away from what is expected, and instead is an exposition of the uniqueness that exists within people of color. There is unique diversity that exists within every person, and hopefully my artwork can be a path for communicating and celebrating this diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chase, for that wonderful paper. At this point, we are going to transition into our question and answer and also our broader reflection phase. So I would love to invite the rest of the panelists to return to the screen so we can start this conversation. While all these panelists are coming in, I'd like to start this conversation by sharing a few brief thoughts. And I just want to say, first off, how proud I am of all these papers. These are incredibly nuanced and complex topics that have profound resonances. When I was thinking through the themes here, I was shocked about how many more layers we can keep on going through. So I'd like to just take a few minutes to kind of point out some of those themes. And I think the thing where I would like to start personally is with the end of Chase Williamson's paper, where she talks about Stuart Hall's idea of becoming. Really, when I was thinking about the larger purview of the symposium, piecing together identities, I was thinking about it along the lines of becoming as an additive process, as something that was going to constitute how things came together to how that forments and shapes and also constructs identity. And I think in each one of your papers, there was absolutely an element of that. There was a quite literal building of identity in all of these instances. For example, Mike Kelly, as Cecilia Dixon points out, literally builds new identities from objects and from these perceptions of memories, and then presents these personages, if we will, as something that the viewer needs to know, as its own discrete subject that can be learned about. Or as Lisa Hill points out, the text of Ligon's I Am Somebody forces the viewer / the reader to embody, to envision, to imagine who that I actually is. And then Williamson also points out how Cheryl and also in her own practice both construct these complex psychological profiles of their subjects. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have Olivia Harrell's discussion of the Savannah tunnel system that shows how identity can be forcibly inscribed, and also to remake the self-conception of these enslaved peoples of color. Her stitching memorial, in turn, reconstitutes these identities, bringing it back again to an additive process. In this, we have the common theme of a plurality of personhoods. Williamson speaks to how identities are like florets. Hill on the fracturing of Ligon's text as a metaphor for the fractured nature of human experience, and how the text of I Am Somebody and also reads through this quasi-universal nature. Even Kelly's very personalized post-human sculptures seemingly invite the idea of a subjective projection of identity. But here, these papers also reveal that the process of becoming is really only half the picture. Indeed, the artworks that were examined also discuss who has the power to become. That is, the power to make and then to remake identity. Kelly, for instance, holds all the power. He is untethered from the bounds of truth and also from the bounds of experience. He is a godlike master of his visual identities. Similarly, the Savannah tunnel system wields the full weight of power of racial oppression. Conversely, Ligon and Fitzgerald also claim the power to rewrite these conceptions. And so the concept of like remaking, as these papers point out, becomes the political act here. So aside for just becoming then, these papers are just as much interested in the idea of unbecoming. Take, for example, how the Savannah tunnel system is not only inscribing a new racist identity, but also is is purely predicated on destroying the subjectivities of the African and also Afro-Caribbean persons who pass through that as a liminal space. This is going to be inverted by the Stitching Memorial, where you have the idea of contemporary walkers, again, overriding these preconceived ideas. Cheryl and also Chase's own portraiture seeks to unbecome these very same perceptions, finding new identities that are beyond the expectations of race. Even Mike Kelly's idea of the banana man is an unbecoming of the actual identity of the banana man from Captain Kangaroo. Identity for these papers is something that's at the very heart of something that is continually reshaped both in the positive and also in the negative. And it's always done through some form of experience, as is pointed out, either physical or conceptual. As the performative aspect of identity here, it's not just what's there, but also what is inferred. Which leaves us with a few questions. That whose identity is actually constructed by these objects? Are these artworks more about our identity as the viewers, or about the artists as the identity of the creator? Indeed, there's almost a disavowal of these artistic identities in favor of the self-perception of the viewer of these artworks. I'm interested in hearing what you all think of this, of what the role of the artist is in making these identities, in making these ideas of the privilege of construction, and how there is a racial dynamic to this privilege of construction. And then finally, it prompts us to ask in all these papers, who has the privilege to interpret? Those are some broad questions to open us up with. But I guess I'm interested in hearing how all of you think of this idea of unbecoming and this idea of reshaping identity in your artworks.
I can go first.
Yeah.
So like you said, identity is always ever evolving. You know, it's constantly one simple thing. And so at the same time, it's also unbecoming. And so like in my speech, identity is kind of like unbecoming what's expected of what society puts on all of us. And then you ask that question, who has the privilege to interpret these racial paintings? And I think that it's open to all audiences, whether you're Black or you're white or whatever race you are, for Black people to be able to see that beauty that exists within themselves and reading that within their own lens and being able to connect it to their own experiences, but also for white audiences to see that there's more to other people that they might not know of, or they don't know like what it's like to be in their shoes. It's kind of just able to kind of just learn new things about other people that they might not know of.
Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I can go. So with Mike Kelly, I feel like a lot of the points that researchers bring up with him are about like his own experience, like potentially that he experienced child abuse. And Mike Kelly repeatedly is like, no, that's not the case. If anything, I experienced aesthetic abuse and just like having to paint the same thing over and over and being trained a certain way to look at art as a child. And I think with that, we have Mike Kelly opening up everything for like a universal, sorry, I think there's noise in the background right now. With Mike Kelly, I think we have like an opening up of his art to kind of like connect with everybody on a psychological level, because with his work in the uncanny, or like with post-humanist art in general, we're looking at just general sentiments of maybe post-Cold War anxieties about technology and consumerism, or the uncanny as a phenomenon in general. And so I just think that with his work, it's kind of making just a blanket statement in a way that everybody is kind of constructed of all these externalities and external anxieties.
Absolutely. It almost puts the responsibility on that interpreter to kind of think through in like this idea of identity formation. Absolutely. Olivia, sorry, go ahead. And I believe I cut someone off, so please go ahead and speak.
No, I was just going to say with that, I think the painting that I studied, Glenn Ligon's I Am Somebody, I think with it being in text form, you mentioned about putting it on the viewer, the interpreter, who has identity. I think with the painting that I studied, you really have to imagine who is the I Am Somebody who has, just studying who has identity, who are people who feel like they need to declare or they have to affirm their identity. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. So in my case, the creator of the art being the tunnels, were the slaves themselves, which was the thing when they were brought over to America, their identity was stripped. Their last names were changed. Everything about them, where they came from was no more. So to force a human being to create their own holding cells and their own means of transportation that separated them from the identity of everyone else that dwelled in the city was pretty dramatic. And so taking the new art, the architecture and the urban design is what I posed, was to invert that and to bring them back, give them back their identity that was once lost in a way so that not only African Americans, but anybody of any race can come and identify with these people, learn about their history, their true history and who their true identity was in Africa. So a lot of these people were brought over from the Ivory Coast. And a lot of their history is rich. Most of these people were kings and queens where they were from. So to be taken from being a king or a queen to be taken to being a slave and forced to basically be nothing, the new art can bring them back their identity.
I think that's such a powerful point, like talking about this idea of empathy and this idea of understanding and the politics of being seen. It becomes such a interesting and important contribution to changing one's own expectations of those unseen ideologies that continually circle around us. We have a few minutes left, so I do want to be sure to open up questions to and to the attendees. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will be sure to ask them. While we're waiting for some questions in the chat, because I'm personally not seeing them if they're there, I'd be very curious to know, Olivia, is the Stitching Memorial something that is actually being built? Is that your design? Is that something like what's the actual logistics behind this?
So my design is a thesis that I'm working on right now. So technically it cannot be built, or it can. This was an idea that I stemmed from when I took a tour. It's called the Underground Tour in Savannah, where you learn about the African American and Haitian culture that dwells in the city. There are actual underground tunnels, of course, and the First African Baptist Church, which is the oldest church in the United States, African church in the United States, has an underground tunnel that it was used as a slave holding place during the Underground Railroad. So in about 15 years, they're talking about actually expanding that tunnel about 15 more feet so people can actually go into this space and actually visit that area. So the tunnel system, that I'm developing and exposing is actually going to link to that site so that people can see the real magnitude of how big this tunnel system was. Like I said, it runs about 8 miles beneath the city. So I'm only focusing on about a 1 mile part of it. So yeah.
It's amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very powerful piece, and I hope it can be realized. We would all advocate in support of seeing that monument come together. It's very powerful reclamation of history. Thank you for sharing your work with us. And thank you to all of our second panelists for sharing your pieces that also contributed to the reconstruction of identity in various ways. I see now we're having our panelists coming back in, and Adira has rejoined us.
I think we have everyone back. It's the wonder of Zoom. But yeah, so I wanted to thank, obviously I was here the whole time watching and just with such pride and admiration for all that these students have done over the last semester. And keep in mind, they were doing this while taking classes and managing the craziness of this year. So huge thanks, huge admiration. And really, these papers are graduate level work, and they're all doing this as undergrads. And it was an honor to work with all of you. We are so grateful to everyone who joined us. We did record this, if you guys all saw the little Zoom recording. So we'll have that available, and I'll make sure the panelists all have a link to that as well. And I hope, of course, everyone will come and visit the Hunter when they feel safe to do so. We would love to have all of you as our guests, and I hope you'll continue to support these young scholars, seek out, learn more about what they were studying. They're bringing us into a new age of scholarship, a new way of being, and a new way of piecing together identities. And for that, we're so grateful, and we need to follow their charge and learn from them and grow with them as they become the leaders of tomorrow. So thank you all. Thank you, Olivia and Stephen, and thank you to our entire audience for joining us today. Major applause.
Really brilliant work. Thank you all so much. Amazing presentations. We couldn't be more thrilled.
Yes, thank you, everyone. This was an amazing experience.